Welcome to the program. We love to invite back guests who proved popular in their first appearance with us. And one of our more popular guests from season 1 was Irina Tsukerman, who was in episode 27 with us, laying out global affairs issues at that time. Now, this episode that I'm referring to aired in the early part of 2024. In fact, it was the first week of 2024. We had recorded it at the tail end of 2023, and so much has changed since then. And I can't tell you how many requests I've had from listeners around the world who want another deep dive into geopolitics now in the era of the second Trump administration in the United States, and with so many events around the world having changed, evolved, taken place. So it's exciting for me to bring back Irina and to revisit some of the topics that we talked about the first time around and look to the future and see what might be around the next corner. Yeah, that's what we do in this program. It's all about the megatrends. It's about the bold thinkers who are shaping perspectives and views of a global economy, our society, and security. So it's great to have Irina back. For those who didn't get that first episode, let me give you a brief reintroduction. Irina is a human rights attorney, geopolitical analyst, and the president of Scarab Rising, a U.S.-based strategic risk and media consultancy. Irina has advised governments, think tanks, and corporations on issues ranging from energy security to counterterrorism and international law. She is a frequent contributor to major media outlets including Al Arabiya, Newsweek, and The National Interest, and her sharp insights into Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and transatlantic affairs have made her a sought-after commentator on international policy and human rights issues. In today's conversation, we're going to unpack Irina's perspective on a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape, from great power competition, including China, Russia, the United States, and security cooperation, to the future of global governance. So without any further delay, I want to get into this conversation. We spoke in the very middle of May in 2025 as we record this conversation. Two quick notes before we start. Number one, geopolitical developments are rapidly evolving. So whenever you are listening to this, I ask you to keep in mind that we had this conversation in the middle of May 2025. By the time you hear it, by the time you listen to it, who knows what will have happened. But geopolitics is one of those things that is impossible to keep up on current events in a podcast format, where I don't know how long into the future it'll be before you listen. But we did our best to have this conversation at a megatrends level so that no matter what evolves, no matter what developments have changed, the basic themes and trajectories of these topics will remain the same. The second thing I ask you to keep in mind is we do the best we can to share with you information that is publicly available. Now, Irina has a unique perspective and has sources and has conversations that we are not always able to share in a public format like this. So give us a little grace as we go through some of these topics, that there are some things that may be out in the public in the future that we were not able to discuss on this show, whether because it was sensitive information or proprietary, if the case may be. So I don't push guests like this too deep into the weeds of certain questions, even though I know some of you would love to get that information, only because I know where the sensitivities are. So with those caveats in mind, we were still able to cover a ton of ground in this conversation, from the conflict in Ukraine, dynamics in the Middle East. We talked a little bit about conflict in Kashmir between India and Pakistan. We did get to tariffs. We did get to global economic challenges. We did get to the perspective of the new U.S. administration. And we did get into a lot of detailed topics around how countries are reacting to the evolving geopolitical landscape around the world. So it's an in-depth conversation. I certainly enjoyed conducting it, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. So without any further delay, I present to you my conversation with Irina Tsukerman. Irina, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
All right, let's begin with kind of where we left off in our recording from, several months ago now. But at that time, you had walked our listeners through the nexus of international challenges that are reported individually, but really are part of a broader connection. And we talked about the semi cooperation, formal cooperation between countries like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Now, while there were individual crises around the world, there's a connection and a through point that many of these nations were really doing this in cooperation against the United States world order. A lot has changed since we last spoke. There's a new administration in the U.S. So let me just begin our conversation today by revisiting that. Do you see the same dynamic fundamentally in the world of those actors working together against the U.S.? And what progress have you seen them make in that journey? And where do you think the biggest potential conflict zone that, as we record in May of 2025, exists today?
Uh, I would say that not only is it continuing, but it has made substantial progress, and new players entered. Um, New players entered the playing field. And what I mean by that is you probably have heard about asymmetrical warfare going on across Europe as well as increasing other parts of the world, involving terrorist organization, Islamist terrorist organization, which appear to be in some form of cooperation with Russia, and they're also getting political and propaganda assistance from China, Iran, and some of these organizations are Iranian proxies. Many of these organizations get weapons from North Korea. So, in addition to this nexus of state actors, there's also now a dimension of non-state actors that has become a lot more substantial. And also, even the state actors are now increasingly engaged in state-backed violence, which are they're less and less concerned about keeping far away from their home home offices through plausible deniability and such. They don't seem to really care. We actually saw some of that even in the recent India Pakistan blow up, where several state actors appear to be active behind the scenes, in addition to the terrorist organization, with potential facilitation by some of the Pakistani security services. China was is said to be quite heavily involved in that instance, and we're seeing similar dynamics elsewhere. Now, the way the new administration is handling that, to say nothing of Europe, and I'll get to Europe and Canada and other Western states momentarily, uh, well, they're really still treating each individual issue as exactly that. They are, on the one hand, they're claiming that they're trying to negotiate with different parties to break them up with their counterparts and allies. On the other hand, by treating each crisis as entirely individual, they're really limiting intelligence that is that is, that would uncover the level of cooperation with the other actors in this crisis. Uh, just to give you an example, Ukraine war, it's hard to not be aware that increasingly Chinese and North Korean soldiers are involved, that Iran has been partnering with Russia on um, various weapons related operations, not to mention crisis communications, cybersecurity, and much else. Despite some sanctions by Congress against Iranian companies and government, the administration is continuing negotiations with both countries, and it's not addressing the fact that they're jointly involved in an attack on another sovereign state. Um, In fact, Russia, if anything, is a potential facilitator for the negotiations with Iran. Same is said for the involvement of these actors in many other flashpoints around the world, and we will see that even when they're not necessarily involved directly in civil wars or local sectarian conflicts, they some of these actors play a facilitating role by selling weapons, by providing logistics and intelligence, or by issuing political support. And the prime example is the conflict with the Houthis in the Red Sea. We are seeing that Russia and China have both assisted Houthis with targeting U.S. ships. China has been selling weapons. Russia has tried to sell weapons through Victor Bout, who was freed from the U.S. custody in a prisoner exchange previously. Um, of course, Iran is heavily backing the Houthis, and North Korea is not too far away, simply as a salesman of weapons and an assistance to Iran on various logistical issues. So we are seeing that prime example of the nexus between non-state actors being used as proxies, not just by one state, Iran, but which was its their traditional patron, but now by a nexus of states. And we are seeing that the administration, despite acknowledging the involvement of at least China in the sale of weapons and in the intelligence cooperation, is not really focusing on the Chinese government's involvement in all of this. At most, there may be some move to sanction companies, weapons companies that are selling arms to the Houthis, but not really a top level decision. So the reason for why this is all going on is quite simple. The administration has a very transactional attitude towards foreign policy and geopolitics. On the one hand, they view a possibility of negotiating with each individual actor on their own terms and acquiring separate deals with all of them, which makes things simpler. On the other hand, they do not want to be too involved politically in any particular crisis, especially those who have a potential to become entrenched or to spread, as part of the electoral promises not to get involved in forever wars, even if they involve US interests in some way. And the third issue is that Trump personally is trying to portray himself as a peacemaker, deal maker, and that means that a very substantial intelligence revelation and prioritizing these crises in a more uh, as a whole framework, as opposed to individual issues to be solved or managed, kind of counters that point, because it just complicates the whole situation. If you're seeing a huge nexus of actors acting in a deliberate anti-Western way, it's much harder to justify cutting individual deals, because then it's more than just a miscommunication, misunderstanding, or a difference in views. It's very clearly an anti-Western paradigm that will not be changed by any tactical moves, and that would deny the administration quick publicity and diplomatic wins that they're aiming for. So it's the entire approach that is based in this approach of ignoring the larger reality of this anti-Western network. Moreover, the administration refuses to acknowledge that there is this ideological element that is quite deeply entrenched, and that will persist no matter what deals are actually signed. Trump has repeatedly countered that there are no permanent enemies or permanent friends, and the entire situation can be managed on a case by case basis. So he refuses to acknowledge that those countries have a long term entrenched agenda that cannot be resolved through transactional approach. And that is a major weakness um, of this point of view, failing to acknowledge that other actors have an agency, an independent agency that is different from the US norms. In that, Trump is actually not all that different from many of the prior administrations. The only thing that's different is his method and approach, but failing to acknowledge the actors and their agency is a mistake that has been sort of par for the course for Washington in general.
So let me take a moment on that one, because there are those in the foreign policy establishment in the U.S., and not just the U.S., in some Western countries, who have started to adopt that. I don't know if it's Trump personally, but we'll call it his administration's foreign policy view, that you can split some of these nations from each other, that they don't have intrinsic trust, that they don't necessarily view each other as true allies to begin with, they're allies of convenience, that there might be a path to drive wedges between them. And though they may not become American allies, we might be able to weaken them by dividing them. Do you think that's naive?
I don't think that concept in itself is naive. In fact, I quite agree that this is exactly what the US should be doing, but I disagree with the way it's being done. I think signing major political or financial agreements or appeasing them in any way as part of this infrastructure is not the way to go and is not going to accomplish that objective. How can that objective be accomplished? Through a mixture of various pressure points, including sanctions and very hard diplomacy, as well as covert action where needed, uh, such as cybersecurity, offensive cybersecurity approaches, intelligence, and so forth. uh, that also means looking at particular sectors in each country and figuring out an individualist approach in addressing how those sectors fit into the big picture. I think the Biden administration was somewhat on the right track in one particular aspect, which was, for instance, to focus on uh, technology decoupling from China, because technology is one of China's top priorities, and it makes sense to deny it access to the greatest innovation that makes China such a big selling point for all of the other actors and its allies. However, there were other problems not being taken into account that undermined this approach, because US was not willing to address other sectors, and isolating only one sector was not sufficiently effective. This administration has a very inconsistent approach to enforcement in general, even if it has some continuity in some of the policies. Moreover, by buying into the narratives that these countries will not prioritize their anti-Western agenda over lucrative deals, it's projecting the U.S. approach to countries with a completely different history, governance structure, political ideology, and methodology, which I think is a major mistake. And if this administration had been more open to intelligence analysis that contradicts its desired outcome, perhaps it would look at the situation a little bit differently.
As you think about Eastern Europe and where we are now, I want to explore two elements. So, one, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, it feels at this point like with the new administration in the US, they are trying to find a way out of engagement, but they can't completely be seen to walk away and be giving total permission for Russia or any other state actor to start moving borders. At the same time, the Europeans are talking a bigger game. They're talking about rearmament. They're talking about pushing back, but they're a long way away from having a credible threat on that. This feels like a conflict that is stuck in some sort of a horrible draw that is still taking lives and is still destroying so much of the future of Ukraine. What do you see as the next step in this conflict? Because it doesn't feel like we're any closer to peace or one side or the other achieving any breakthrough.
Well, first of all, it's too early to be completely optimistic about the European role in it. The truth of the matter is there is a radical restructuring ongoing. It may not be going at the pace that we would like it to see, but it's very clear that the Europeans are certainly increasing their own armament and discussing policies that even a year ago would have seemed impossible. They're looking at strengthening NATO, at utilizing NATO, they're coordinating more on sanctions, and they're looking even at building up its own military. I'm not going to say that that will happen overnight. It's going to be a very challenging path, but the fact that this is being discussed at all means that eventually there may be a breakthrough if they ramp up their capacity sufficiently, and if they manage to position themselves in a more unequivocal way. What I mean by that is that for the past couple of decades, I would say since the end of the Cold War, economy was the major focus of the European Union and Western states in general. They believed that conventional warfare with traditional adversaries was far behind them. They focused almost exclusively on tactical counterterrorism, but there is also a strategic counterterrorism that looks into the role of larger state players that's still far away from being seriously considered, only starting to. And tactical counterterrorism was basically a response to non-state actors engaging in terrorist activity, and they saw economy and trade as the ultimate peacemaker that could overcome um, and build overcome challenges between different states and build bridges no matter who was in charge. That essentially empowered Russia, China, and Iran, because European countries in particular, but even others, were willing to engage, normalize, and trade with them. This is, starting this view is finally starting to break down, although not fully, and Europeans, to some extent, are still treating these threats as somewhat separate and prioritizing different things from the US, and there isn't a full integrated outlook on all of this. Another factor that worth considering is Ukrainian own innovation. It is not as dependent on external resources as it was in the beginning of the war, and it's bringing results. Again, we are still far away from pushing Russian troops completely out of Ukrainian territories, but the fact that Russia has not been able to make substantial territorial progress in quite some time is a measure of success. And the fact that Russia is now focused on attacking civilians, horrible as it is from a humanitarian perspective, is also an acknowledgement of its military weakness that cannot be easily overcome, even with the methods that Russia has employed up until this point. Finally, the third factor that is yet to be fully developed but is starting to be considered is acquiring more integrated assistance from uh, the so-called global south, non-Western countries, playing a role both diplomatically, on a humanitarian level, economic level, or even military level. We have seen a change from, for instance, India being almost exclusively tied economically and to some extent in defense to Russia, to becoming increasingly open to greater trade, and that includes selling ammunition to Ukraine, not what happened in the beginning of the war. We have seen countries like Saudi Arabia get involved in the peace process, and but also get involved in increase their cooperation with the Ukraine quite substantially. And we are also seeing that a number of countries that have had positive relations with Russia up until this point are wary of the effect of the war on their own interests, such as access to grain, such as maritime security, such as information warfare uh, that undercuts their own interests to some respect. All of these things are signs that the situation within non-Western countries, who for a long time were completely disinterested in this conflict, is not as simple as it may appear and worthy of reconsidering strategically. And we are seeing that US has shown signs of finally understanding that point by, for instance, trying to both pressure and coax countries like UAE into focusing on US technology versus Chinese technology, and that's bearing some fruits. These countries are still harboring a lot of the hostile actors, Russian oligarchs, and so forth. But that situation could be fixable if U.S., Europe, and other Western states were focused on pressuring these countries to expel or not to cooperate with these actors, and offered lucrative alternatives and other prospects that uh, instead of simply threatening sanctions and so forth. So the independent economic growth of the Gulf states and India and some of the African countries, I think, that are inclined, by the way, to be more pro-Western, like Rwanda and Kenya, shows that there is definitely room for thinking outside the box in the way this whole situation is being handled. Maybe not directly, maybe not to expect these countries to provide huge weapons and military and logistical assistance, but um, I think creativity in diplomacy, creativity in incentives and deals, and providing trade status for countries that are more willing to cooperate with the West against these troublemaking actors could be the way to go. But both the US and Europe have been very hesitant. For the US, the answer is quite simple. Um, there's been a very significant polarization in policy, and the current administration is extremely transactional and just not that interested in exploring this sort of network diplomacy. With Europe, dealing with non-Western countries on anything but direct trade has been problematic due to the differences in views on democracy, human rights, and so forth, which Europe has traditionally prioritized, politically speaking. So they're still willing to trade with these countries, but they're not necessarily willing to engage in very in-depth political rapprochement. And I think unless that starts to change, I don't really see a way out of the stalemate.
When we think about the other aspects in Eastern Europe over the last year plus, election interference is pretty high on that list, and perhaps the most blatant and flagrant version of that happened in Romania, but it's certainly not the only country. And we also have some leaders like those in Hungary who are just naturally more confrontational to begin with and looking to extract as much as they can for their country by leaning and playing sides against each other. How big of a threat do you think that is to European unity in the face of what we've already seen with Russian aggression and what we're likely to continue to see in the future?
I have no problem with tough diplomacy and countries, trying to defend their national interest. The problem is that's not what Hungary and other actors of that sort are doing. They're not. They're not simply. They're not necessarily prioritizing their national interest. They're prioritizing Russia's interests, and their own interests are suffering as a result. Hungary is not in a good economic shape. A lot of the wealth went to corrupt urban-linked institutions. There is a significant demographic decline. There are significant social problems, and instead of focusing on resolving them, we are seeing Hungary essentially promoting pro-Russian interests and politics and demanding money from the European Union, but that money is not being used to the end that they claim it's being used. That's the real problem here. Now, what to do with these problem actors? The good news about really corrupt puppet regimes is that eventually people get tired of them and they start to collapse. And if you want to help effective oppositions, the opposition that really does represent the interest of those countries, there are ways of doing that. We are seeing that in Hungary, there's a growing successful challenge from a center right party that actually walks the walk on these traditional values and a traditional trade and political approach that is valued but is being woefully misrepresented by the Orban government that does talk the talk on nationalism, but in reality is essentially kowtowing to a foreign interest. Even in Serbia and Slovakia, we are seeing a great deal of growing dissatisfaction and pressure on the governments to limit their involvements. In Romania, the government has tried to prevent pro-Russian actors to gain traction. The problem is that in countries like Georgia and Romania that are economically poor, it's very easy to buy influence. And if the Western countries in more developed European and Western states are serious about countering Russian political influence and not merely making symbolic defense and deterrence gestures. They should be finding ways of investing into those countries and making it much more difficult for oligarchs and assorted corrupt interests to gain confidence and gain trust and to gain influence in those states. That is the part that's not being done nearly enough. It's just not has not been serious in this all of society response to helping financially less developed countries that have particularly those in post-Soviet bloc space that have been struggling with the impact of Russian influence for decades now.
How serious do you think the threat is that whatever happens in Ukraine, let's say there is a settlement or a ceasefire that holds for some period of time, one of the concerns has been that the Russians could then look to move on to another country. asymmetrically or through, again, blunt force. How seriously do you take that threat in the short term?
They're already doing that. It's not news. Not only have they already occupied areas of other countries even before they came to Ukraine, which means Georgia, which means Transnistria, in Moldova, which means essentially keeping Belarus as their pocket proxy, and of course making political gains in aforementioned Hungary, Slovakia, and Serbia. But they are also being politically involved in countries like Germany and the United Kingdom. Even efforts in France and Italy. There's been quite violent support for separatism in Spain. There's been attacks such as fires in Poland, and there's been cybersecurity attacks and other incidents in France, and uh, assorted information warfare all over Europe. There's been a cyber war with Estonia, and potential and similar measures in Latvia and Lithuania. So we're seeing that Russia is actually expanding its influence. It's not waiting for the results, for the outcome of the conflagration in Ukraine. And by the way, it reinvaded Ukraine after having made its first move over 10 years ago in Crimea, and seeing largely silence and very limited sanctions from the West, and a complete lack of interest. So it's been testing waters for some time, but not just testing waters. It has been gaining ground both politically and militarily, and that's something that cannot be discounted. There isn't necessarily such a thing as just one massive invasion, although that happened in Ukraine. um and it was very obvious that it was going to happen. But there is also this creeping invasion through active measures, through covert action, through political lobbying, and Russia has been engaged in all of that, plus also, as I mentioned, engaging in increasing acts of aggression and violence, starting with attempted assassinations of dissidents and defectors on UK soil, and now moving on to threatening politicians in France and other countries.
So we have a fair number of listeners in Western Europe, and what I hear from my friends in that part of the world is that they are concerned, obviously, about the events in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, about Russian influence, but they feel a bit removed from it. And I think the case that you've laid out for us is, while there may not be bombs dropping on your cities and there may not be physical attacks in your spaces, Russian influence can absolutely affect your life in any number of ways. And in an era of misinformation, disinformation, information warfare, cybersecurity, war can be redefined and brought anywhere, anytime. So help our listeners who, let's say they're listening to us in the Netherlands or in Belgium or in France. Help paint a picture for them about what Russian aggression could look like in the coming years.
Well, first of all, there isn't one war. There isn't one way of fighting a war. This is a war with many fronts, and Russia is fighting all of them simultaneously. And these countries are only starting to wake up. Second, we should keep in mind that Europe is not that big. France may feel distant from Poland, from Ukraine, but reality is, even the physical distance is not as huge as one might think. And with relatively open borders, anyone can travel anywhere. Their communications have become globalized, trade has become globalized, and of course, travel is also globalized. So even if you limit migrants, even if you try to crack down on your campaign finance laws to avoid Russia or others being able to bribe your politicians, that a lot of that still happens behind the scenes. There's been an institutional crawl that transcends borders. So Russia's aggression does not have to be limited to the full front warfare as it does in Ukraine. In fact, that was the least desired result. The original outcome Putin was hoping for would be a quick political coup that would allow him to place a puppet like Yanukovych in Ukraine, and then save his resources for other things. I don't think Russia necessarily wanted a full scale war everywhere to advance its goals, I think it would have preferred political coups and covert action, which is what it does far better than fighting military wars. And I think it has been trying to achieve amplify its impact through these active measures, through propaganda wars, but now also through attacks, assassinations. There's both a combination of desperation from the military losses in Ukraine and from the increasing closeness of NATO, but at the same time a brazenness and a sense that Russia understands that Europe is still not there when it's willing to give it all the way it did during World War II. We are not at World War II level yet. I know that many people call the situation 1939. Maybe it is, but let's just say that while European states have been trying to build up the militaries, they're not at the point where they're willing, ready, or able to commit individual forces to stop Russia's aggression away from their own borders. And that is something Russia is very willingly exploiting. To be clear, Russia is weak enough militarily that it could have been stopped with a coalition of Western actors and their militaries in Ukraine before it got anywhere further, but there hasn't been political will to accomplish that result. There's been this fear of confrontation, of any sort of confrontation, any offensive action, and there's been an excessive focus on defensive action, whether military or resilience building. Now that's again that dynamic is starting to change, but just because of the way European political networks work, while Russia, that is being governed by an authoritarian leader, makes its snap decisions, they take years to argue about the best possible outcome that avoids with minimal damage. Some of it is part for the course of being a liberal democracy, but on the other hand, there's also this sleepiness. There is some political corruption. There is inertia, and just idea of trying to avoid discomfort to your own society that has no place when you're really fighting an existential war. Which brings me to the final point. The European Union is starting to realize that it could become an existential war, but because their last example of an existential war was World War II, and because this war is far more asymmetrical and political than it is military, they have not fully come to terms that an existential war is not necessarily a fully military war. It's also as much a political war, an asymmetrical war, a hybrid war. And until they make the realization that the war is existential, that Russia does intend to destroy the Western civilization through any means, and most likely not through the military means, they will not be putting out the resources and the time and the radical solutions. By radical, I don't mean extremist, I mean out of the box, innovative, and best fit to the current circumstances rather than outdated and stuck in the Cold War era. And Russia will continue making gains even as it also suffers losses where its own proxies have failed to live up to the expectations.
So I don't want to spend too much time in the Middle East because you can spend hours on it and only scratch the surface. But let me focus on what I think has been the biggest development in the last year plus since we last spoke on this program, and that is that Iran's proxies have largely been dismantled or significantly degraded. They've lost their state actor partner in Syria. It feels like a diminished Iran in that part of the world compared to where they have been in the recent past. So we talk about Iran being an important part of that anti-American alliance, if you will. Is our perception correct that Iran has lost some of that influence? And if so, what do you think that means for prospects of a broader peace agreement throughout the Middle East in the coming years?
Look, we've been there before, and we've been there with the post Soviet Russia in the 1990s. There was an opportunity to follow the political collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc with an extremely carefully guided transition. The West failed to do that, and the result brought us back Putin. With Iran, the military intelligence and image blows that it has suffered could have been the beginning of the end. In fact, Western reports indicated that the regime was close to to a point of collapse, which could have been managed in many different ways, and many of them quite positive, both for the people of Iran and for the region and the world in general. But instead, what we're seeing is a return to the failed cycle of diplomacy that this administration, which has no Iran experts as far as I see, um, is attempting to do, and essentially salvaging the regime. Trump's comments to that effect have been very, very enlightening. Trump views the regime and the people of Iran as one and the same, and views the regime as a protector and defender of Iranian national interests, which I would say most Iranians know, even if they disagree on everything else, will probably agree is not the case. Um, the fact that he's viewing it as such, and he views the regime as having a degree of political legitimacy despite all the other things that it has done, means that that US is not going to be a major facilitator in such a process. On the contrary, it will preserve the status quo, giving Iran the respite it needs to rebuild, especially if it comes to any sort of financial deals with the US. We've heard talk of Section 123 that is being promoted, which refers to civilian nuclear energy cooperation. If US not only signs off on some sort of a non-aggression pact with Iran, but also, in exchange for promises of nuclear non-proliferation, but then also provides assistance on crucial energy and other programs, it will enable Iran to rebuild its facilities through financial uh, misgivings. Nothing in the Middle East is static. Even a failed and weakened actor can resurrect itself if it gets the outside assistance that it needs. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other threats at the moment. Just as Iran appears to be waning in influence, Turkey and assorted Islamist groups appearing to be on the rise and looking to co-opt the spaces that Iran once held. And we have to remember that a lot of these proxies and terrorist organizations are not always ideological. Some of them are mercenaries, and some of them gravitate to any revolutionary ideology, if it's not, even if the doctrine is not exactly the close fit to what they originally motivated them. And we see that, for instance, organizations like Al Qaeda have cooperated with both Sunni Islamist and Shia Islamist regimes and actors, which means that the proxy network that Iran has dislodged could be taken over or collaborate effectively with Turkey or with other actors if they see that there's something to be gained. But all of these groups have an interest in self-perpetuation, and therefore they will look for any opportunity to preserve themselves, even if their original patron is not no longer at full capacity. That is something to keep in mind, as well as the fact that Iran, while in a state of deep competition with other regional actors such as Turkey, such as Saudi Arabia, does have a keen way of finding ideological and mercenary allies, even among its competition, and that is also something to keep in mind. While it has a very tense relationship with Turkey on many levels, they have and continue to this day cooperate on various issues, particularly against the West, circumventing sanctions, countering Kurdish nationalism, and the like. Saudi Arabia is in general no friend of Iran, but there are factions inside the government that have always looked for cooperation rather than um, distancing themselves from Iran for entirely financial reasons, or because they're antipathetic and uh, to the West. So that's also something to be wary of. The Gulf states have not broken their relations with Iran after Iran was weakened by recent developments. You would think that if their primary concern was Iran's growing strength in the past, that they would immediately seize upon that opportunity. But instead, we have seen something uniquely different in the days following the November election that brought Trump, which everyone assumed to be somewhat of an anti-Iran hawk, you have seen Saudi military personnel, fairly senior, traveling to Iran, and since then there were more meetings and more collaborations. So, including in the defense sector, which was highly unusual. We're also seeing that Saudis have opposed U.S. actions against the Houthis and have advanced their peace process. So the situation is far from black and white, and the fact that the um current policy on Iran in the West is highly disjointed, and in the case of US and Israel, basically at odds with each other, is something that Iran and its allies are likely to capitalize on to the extent that they can, which is quite a lot because they know the West far better than the other way around.
So let's talk about the West and let's talk about the United States. Since the new administration has come in, there has been some noise and distractions, but if we put it all together, there does seem to be an emerging worldview that we can discern. Whether it is the trash talking about Greenland and Panama, and between the U.S. and Canada, if there is a one through line through all of that, it seems to be this reemergence of a doctrine of Western Hemisphere dominance and a message being sent to China, to Russia, to others in the world: don't mess in our backyard, to the degree that we'll go and seize territory if we think we need to. Now, again, we can all discern how much a noise that is versus reality, but it does seem to be a drawing of lines of sorts. How do you see that dynamic with the new administration of effectively trying to entrench itself in its own region as it, at least verbally, tries to extract itself from other parts of the world, like the Middle East and like Eastern Europe?
I think the approach is going to be very different, in that the administration is focused less on confrontations with its adversaries or competitors and more on seizing the resources it needs to achieve primacy, which is why just as China is building spy bases in Cuba and proliferating all over Latin America and investing heavily in telecommunications in the Middle East and building up cultural and financial relations in various countries, U.S. is focused not on countering all of this blow by blow, blow to blow, but by trying to get geopolitical strategic waterways like the Panama Canal or uh, resources like Greenland. Now the question is, why would U.S. care about seizing Greenland when it has its own vast natural resources that are not even being developed to the full capacity and quite as aggressively? The issue is a strategic communication of primacy and dominance for its own sake. Rather than simply having the resources, U.S. needs to fight long-term battles against those states. We're also seeing U.S. Pivot to the Indo-Pacific primary strategies, building on what the Biden administration actually envisioned with IMEC. I think U.S. is hoping that that the deals it has concluded with the Gulf states would also position it to more effectively capitalize on the Indo-Pacific relations and to give the Quad and other local uh, in the Middle Eastern alliances as well, some more teeth. But amidst all of that, you see that this effort at grand strategy and based in these pillars of connectivity, counterterrorism, and economic rapprochement is being undercut by a very transactional approach with countries that have an entirely different political culture, heavily based on long-term trust and vision, and who are similarly willing to diversify their relations simply because they don't trust the US to, at the end of the day, respond to regional threats. Um, so instead of isolating China in response to US technology offers, they continue to cooperate with China in other areas and do both rather than gravitate towards one. So I think this is a major strategic error in the US approach. If it only focuses on acquisition of resources and control of waterways, not only will it alienate the actors and create a major nationalist backlash in those areas, which is counter to what it's trying to achieve, and gain more enemies that are going to be very uncooperative and force us to expend more resources achieving the same goal it could do otherwise. But it also basically ignores the source of the problem, which is the growing influence of these actors, and that influence is not limited to resources. China, for instance, is not big on the resources in Greenland. It has focused its energies on Africa quite effectively and essentially driving US out of many places it could have relatively easy access to previously. Latin America remains a vast playing field despite one or two deals that have been concluded recently supposedly to counter China. So there is no comprehensive strategy, whereas China does have a very comprehensive strategy and approach to advancing its interests around the world. And that's a big difference, and that's why US is on the losing track in terms of projecting that image at this moment.
So you answered my what would have been my next question, which is China's strategy. So let's jump now to probably the biggest issue that's emerged since the new administration took office in the U.S., which is a unilateral declaration, effectively, of economic conflict, if not warfare, against so much of the world at one time. I do think even for those who knew the administration was serious about trying to rebalance global trade, very few, I think, thought the US would take this kind of approach. There was an assumption that they would really zone in on China, build an alliance of countries to try and change the behaviors there. Instead, while they did single out China, they have been engaged in an economic back and forth with virtually every country in the world. I'm not asking you to analyze it from the economic perspective, but from a geopolitical perspective. How do you think that this policy is going to play out for the United States, given that it's not just focused on China? Now we're talking about an entire global trade discussion.
Now, here's the thing. None of that makes any sense from any perspective, whether economic, geopolitical, political, or anything else. If you look at it, as a strategy to assert any sort of interest. But if you're looking at it as a quick way to make money on market volatility, it makes perfect sense and has already achieved its goal. We have seen markets lose trillions of dollars in just the first weeks of this liberation day policy, and that money went somewhere, and that money went to speculators and people who had insider knowledge of this volatility. And every time the market goes up or goes down in response to this seemingly meaningless rebalancing and arbitrary policies regarding random countries, somebody is making money off of that. So if you want to be what if there isn't necessarily a long-term geopolitical goal to be effective, or to build any sort of factory infrastructure in the US, but what if the goal is simply to exploit these spaces and opportunities that arise as a result of uh, disbalance and confusion. In that case, it makes complete sense and has worked out pretty well because there has been a lot of confusion. I'm sure you've heard reports of good allies like Japan not being able to get a clear response on what it would take to remove the tariffs altogether, or what kind of deal US is looking for with countries like Israel, which is in the middle of a war, which is considered a close ally, and which does not have this negative trade balance that Trump is so concerned about. The policy also makes no sense, especially given that there's been weeks of behind the scenes of negotiations. Israel has removed all of its tariffs against the US, and it's not clear what the administration wants to get regard. So, given that there's no clear articulated objective in these bilateral negotiations or multilateral frameworks, including isolating China, the only conclusion a reasonable person could go to is that the trade war is not at all about geopolitics or asserting US primacy or returning manufacturing or rebuilding essential industries in the US. Uh, it's not even about the so called economic nationalism and protection of the US industries. It's only about some actors involved in this policy being able to exploit these tensions in their own private favor.
So now, as we think about the biggest possible picture here, if we just step back and look at the U.S. as the leader economically, geopolitically in the West, as we call it, if we think about China as the primary challenger to the U.S. economically, geopolitically, the assumption has been that over time we would see that gap close. That at some point China might be able to supplant the U.S. At least in geopolitical influence, if not economics. Given the decisions of the last year plus, do you believe that that is has accelerated? Do you believe the U.S. position is still a strong one? That with modifications to a strategy, uh, the U.S. can regain and retain its position as a global leader? Or do you feel we are watching a paradigm shift in real time from one great power to another?
I wouldn't call at this point China a great power simply because it's in a outside this U.S. component. It's on a very backward streak economically and politically speaking, and I'll get to that in a moment. But it is very clear that U.S. is walking back, abandoning its leadership on all fronts: geopolitical, economic, diplomatic. It's abandoning long term relationships that took decades to cultivate, and it's abandoning its positions in favor of seemingly muscular but extremely reactionary short term and tactical policy on one front. It's actually causing a lot of resentment and creating unintended consequences such as networks, such as loss of intelligence cooperation, such as great deal of distrust, which could leave us isolated and significantly weakened domestically and in terms of external position. What I mean about China on being on a backwards trajectory is that separately and apart from that, and while China has certainly opportunistically tried to exploit the vacuum of power that is being presented by U.S. withdrawal from the international scene, its own policies are also alienating a lot of potential supporters. She has been an extremely nationalistic leader in a way that has been off-putting to many. For the first time, NATO has decided that China is actually a national security threat and not just an economic competitor. It has been reviewing its policy, which is a big shift from even a few years ago. That's not to say that that all the European countries or Canada will suddenly abandon their interest in China. In fact, if nothing else, the U.S. Meddling in Canadian elections has pushed the country closer to China. But overall, and while China is trying to make good business everywhere and advance cultural ties, there's also a lot of backlash because its policies have been so extreme. It has been driving Western companies out of its own borders to its own economic detriment. It has been accused of racism by a number of African countries that are now looking for partnerships, if not with the U.S., then with Japan, India, South Korea, the European Union, and other, even Turkey and other middle powers. We are seeing that. That India, while is still very far from being an equal competitor to China, is certainly on the rise in many ways and is strategically moving to provide itself as a both a connectivity, geopolitical, and a security alternative, and Chinese influence in every way. In some ways, more successful than others. But if China keeps the same extreme approach, it will force countries out of its sphere of influence, just as it has previously won them away from the United States. So yes, U.S. is losing that influence, but China is only gaining it because of this, not because of its own merit so much, but because of U.S. absence. Should U.S. positions shift, I think many countries would be all too happy to distance themselves from at least some aspects of Chinese China envisioned world order, which, and for those who are not aware, the Chinese view of one world, one family, and so forth is actually placing China in the singular dominant position of the one and only superpower, with everyone essentially being a tributary and a very junior partner, not an equal in any sense of the word. And I think many countries, especially bigger ones like India, are very resentful of that view, even if they find it immediately lucrative to do business with China, especially with the US being absent.
So, as we wrap this conversation, I always like to ask guests like yourself who are so informed about the world the questions that you're asking that are not in the news today, that maybe nobody else is asking, or the trends and topics that you feel are happening right in front of our eyes, but we're not paying attention to. So, give us an insider's view. What are you looking at? What stories should we be watching here in the weeks and months to come?
Well, I think the one, I mean, there's going to be a lot of back and forth on various fronts. The more US withdraws, the more military flashpoints we're going to see. The India Pakistan skirmish was hardly a coincidence. After all, just a few years ago, India very successfully destroyed some of the capabilities and infrastructure related to the same terrorist organizations that took part in this instant attack. So, seeing that the U.S. is distracted, that it has accepted a certain amount of chaos and even facilitating a certain amount of chaos, it certainly provides motivation and back into a certain framework to actors who are willing to cross the boundary of lawfulness in pursuit of their interests. So that's definitely a dynamic to watch. Proliferation of flashpoints, even in areas that have been relatively contained and where there doesn't seem to be an obvious reasons for immediate violent confrontations. The second issue is and the rise of corporations and corporate government complex, not just military industrial, as people like to talk about, but actually non-military. I would say more non-military than military. Really, if you see that the companies closest to Donald Trump, they're not necessarily the defense companies; they're the big tech companies with significant energy interests, and and cryptocurrency companies. So these sort of interests are likely to be playing an outsized geopolitical role, on par with some governments, and maybe more than some lesser active governments, in a way that will challenge the current understanding of geopolitics completely. When you have private companies buying up mines to affect, to affect rare earth minerals process towards EVs, green transition, or defense tech, or computing, or anything else, they're playing a role that has been traditionally played by governments. Um, when they're pooling their resources to acquire both AI and the energy resources that empowers AI, and the cryptocurrency that advances trade interests, they're becoming like almost independent players, like micro governments, but with a corporate approach. So, whatever you think of it, is definitely happening. It's definitely playing a huge uh, role in the current transaction sphere. And some of these companies may be in the future running their own paramilitaries to protect their interests in high risk states and beyond. So, if governments feel that they're inadequately sourced to play an active political role, they could be displaced by these type of quasi-private interests with significant government links, and it's not necessarily going to be positive for many people.
As always, appreciate your insights. If folks would like to learn more about you, about your work, to follow your thoughts, what's the best way for them to do so?
I have a consulting company called Scarab Rising. I also have an information warfare think tank I'm involved in, called the Washington Outsider Center for Information Warfare, where which is dedicated not only to educating the public about information warfare, what it is, and how to deal with it, but also providing investigative look at stories that are not being dealt with by the media, or not being dealt with objectively, so to speak. Um, Finally, I'm on LinkedIn, very active as a professional, so feel free to reach out and connect with me there if you want to talk.
As always, thank you for taking the time to work with us, to talk with us and our audience. I will put the links that you just described there in the description of this podcast, this episode. Thank you so much again for the hour.
Thank you so much. It was great as always.
One of my goals for doing this podcast is to give all of you who are interested in global affairs and big mega trends a consultative view, much like you might receive if you were in a large company and you were seeking information that would be valuable to the business decisions that you're going to make. Or if you were in government and you needed information tailored to policies that you might be implementing. So the challenge with doing a show like this is that we can't dive into every single solitary individual regional challenge or crisis, right? We have to keep it high level enough to give a basic insight and analysis of global affairs, but we don't have enough time to get into the meat and potatoes of every single individual conflict. But I want to take a moment to talk about what we said at the end of that conversation, because it's echoed in conversations that I have outside of this podcast with people who don't wish to be recorded, who don't want to come on the show, who really remain in the background of policy making at companies as well as in governments. But I have the opportunity from time to time to interact with these folks. And while I would never violate their trust in sharing specifically what they tell me, I can share themes that I hear in that part of my life with what gets discussed publicly on programs like this. And the number one theme that we talk about in this episode that I hear in other parts of my life from people who are in a position to know is the general pullback of the United States as the preeminent and exclusive major geopolitical player in all regions of the world. The general withdrawal of U.S. engagement and interest, whether it's from a military standpoint, a societal standpoint, an economic standpoint. And it's not that the United States is going to be supplanted by China or any other nation globally, but regionally. There is a growing consensus that the United States, whether you believe it is by necessity, because it is at a certain age of its maturity where it naturally begins to wane in its interest as well as its capability to project power globally, or because of a choice being made by the current administration, but a combination of factors in U.S. society that are leading it to step back from its role as the preeminent global power on the planet. Whether by force or by choice, the conclusion is the same, that the United States will increasingly play a smaller role globally than it has played over the last 60 or 70 years plus. And as it withdraws, more flashpoints will emerge as regional players seek to fill the void left by a declining or departing or withdrawing superpower. And that really is the theme of so much of the conversations that we will have on this show, but what will be happening around the world as time carries forward. That this isn't necessarily a moment of a paradigm shift from one empire to the next. This may be a paradigm shift from a preeminent, overwhelming global superpower to a world that doesn't have one, that has nothing but regional powers with spheres of influence that have to negotiate this new world for a certain period of time until a new preeminent power arises and emerges, if, and it's a big if, one does. So I offer to you this perspective that we may not be looking at a typical international changing of the guard as we did at the end of the British Empire and the slow but inexorable emergence of an American empire, or at the end of a Dutch period of dominance that would be replaced by a British period of dominance. And we can go all the way back through the history books to look at these eras and these periods of time. But what if we are entering a period in our history for an extended period of time where there simply is no preeminent power? Where a U.S. decline doesn't mean the U.S. still isn't in a leadership position. It simply doesn't exert as much power, isn't able or willing to project it as far, isn't willing to be as engaged, and is willing to step back to allow regional players closer to the challenges of their territories to take a leadership role as long as the United States feels it's within its general interests. That will be a very different world for decision makers, for citizens. But is it going to be a better world or a worse world? And so this is a question I pose to all of you listening to this show. First of all, I'd love to know if you agree with that perspective, that we may not be at an inflection point of a changing of the guard of empires, but simply a changing of the guard from a preeminent superpower to a world without one or any, merely regional power players. So do you agree with that? Do you feel that's where it's going? And then number two, is it good or bad? And from whose perspective and relative to what alternatives? What I will leave you with is the many people that I talk to outside of this show, many of them feel it's bad. Many of them feel that a world without a preeminent power is an inherently dangerous world with rivalries and competitions that explode into conflict as multiple powers battle with each other for regional influence and more players emerge to challenge those weaker powers. That a world without a preeminent power is a world with many powers, and therefore a world full of conflict of nation states and non-state actors competing for ever smaller chunks of territory. I hear that. I think that's a very legitimate perspective. But I would also challenge that a world with a preeminent power has plenty of conflict on its own, initiated by that power, but also initiated by those who are not happy with that setup and who are willing to fight hard to change it. That there's just as much rebellion against one power as there is conflict among many. I don't know that there is a better or a worse, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective. And if you'd like to give that to me, feel free to leave comments. For those of you who are listening to this through a channel that allows for commentary, including YouTube. And feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm on all the major social media channels, and I'm also available to talk to directly through email, info@brianjmatos.com. Would love to hear from you. Thank you all for listening to this program and my perspective. I look forward to talking to you again in the next episode, and I encourage you all to subscribe to this podcast to be the first to hear new episodes when they're released. My almost weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, Q&A exclusively on YouTube. And for those who enjoy this program, I encourage you to share with your network. If this episode is compelling to you and to those that you listen or to those you talk with, I would appreciate you sharing it with them and getting more subscribers so we continue to grow our community of curious minds. Thank you all again for listening. Look forward to talking to you again next time. And between now and then, I hope you will all remain and stay curious.